Throughout the history of the internet, a commonly asked question has been asked countless times. That is, who would win in a fight between an MMA fighter or a chimp? Obviously, this scenario is purely a fantasy and likely will never happen. However, for argument's sake, we shall be answering this question. In doing so, hopefully we'll dismiss a few myths that surround both MMA fighters and chimpanzees. For reference, we'll assume that the MMA fighter is a professional with a record of 10-0 who fights in the UFC. Not only this, but they stand around 85 kilograms. In other words, they're a pretty good fighter who would annihilate the vast majority of the human population in combat. Technically, in terms of martial arts, they'd also be very skilled too. As for the chimp, they're typically smaller than humans, so in this case, it will weigh around 60 kilograms. Both fighters will be male, and the chimp will have a typical background in terms of chimpanzee fighting. In other words, they're a pretty typical chimp with no outstanding feats of athleticism or strength when compared to other chimps. Lastly, let's talk about the rules. Due to it being impossible to teach a chimp MMA rules, we're assuming that this fight will take place without rules. Here there will be no weapons, no cage, and no referee. In other words, it will be a fight to the death. Hypothetically speaking, it wouldn't be possible to teach a chimp MMA fighting, as it's not intelligent enough to avoid its natural instincts when attacked. With this said, it's pointless trying to stick a chimp into an MMA environment, which would never happen. So, who would win, and why? If you were still unsure, a chimp would likely destroy a professional MMA fighter. As mentioned, by human standards, an MMA fighter is like a king. However, when put against a chimp, they're more like a lowly peasant. Firstly, chimps are naturally way more athletic than humans, have better stamina, jumping skills, and strength. In fact, studies show that chimps are roughly 1.5 times stronger than humans. This may not sound like much, but this is a huge strength advantage. Generally, if you fight a bigger human, they may be around 10% stronger than you, which is already a very noticeable difference. However, if they were 1.5 times stronger, this would be an insane difference. This would mean that the MMA fighter's normal strength and athleticism advantage would be reduced to 0 in this case. The MMA fighter may be more technical, but this would likely be irrelevant. In terms of human fighting metrics, the MMA fighter would know a lot more things such as submissions and foot movement. Having said this, the chimp will naturally have a lot of fluid movements hardwired into their brain. Regardless of technique, this wouldn't faze the chimp. Even if the MMA fighter started on the back of the chimp with a locked-in rear naked choke, the strength advantage would likely overcome this. In this scenario, the chimp could grab the hand or arm of the MMA fighter and easily open the grip. In doing so, they could also rip off or break fingers in the process. That's correct. A chimp is designed to maim its opponents, which includes ripping fingers off. Not only would this be painful for the MMA fighter, but it would mean techniques like punches and grappling would become almost impossible. On a similar note, even if the human fought a very strategic game, it would still likely be irrelevant due to the strength and intensity of the chimp. This brings us on to our next point, which is that chimps naturally fight dirty, and combined with their strength, they can easily kill. Whilst there are dirty martial arts around that teach eye gouges and groin strikes, this still happens against other humans. Naturally, due to similar strength levels, this makes these techniques very difficult to pull off. However, if you are incredibly strong, These techniques now become much easier. In short, freak strength makes doing any physical activity much easier and gives the advantage to the dirty attacker. One of the main ways that chimps fight dirty is that they are known to grab things and literally rip them off. This means ripping off human hands, fingers, eyes, or even entire faces. There are two ways in which this can be done. The first is by using their hands, which are incredibly strong. Unlike humans, chimps have much more complicated structures in the bones of their hands, which allows them to grip much harder items. The second way of ripping off digits, eyes and groins is with their mouths. It's more obvious, but chimps have very sharp teeth that are designed for combat. Therefore, they can either rip off limbs with their hands or bite them, depending on what is easier. Compared to a human, this makes fighting a lot easier for the chimp. So, could an MMA fighter ever beat a chimp? In a fair fight, there's very little chance for an MMA fighter to ever beat a chimp. However, there are a few ways they could win. First, one of these would be if there were a number of MMA fighters who could gang up on a chimp. This number would be debatable, but there's a good chance that a few fighters would get hurt or killed during this brawl, but still end up winning. Secondly, an MMA fighter could win if they were armed with a weapon such as a knife. There's still a very good chance the fighter would die or get seriously injured. However, if they managed to strike the neck and defend with the knife, they could win. Of course, this is unfair and gives the fighter a huge unnatural advantage over the chimp. Lastly, the fighter could win if they fought a baby chimp. Again, this would mean a fully grown man against an underdeveloped chimp. Here, the chimp's natural strength advantage would be diminished massively, so they would lose their strength edge. So here are a few takeaways from the man versus chimp debate. Firstly, just because a pro MMA fighter would easily lose to a chimp, it doesn't mean that MMA fighters are bad when it comes to combat. As has been established throughout, there are levels to the game when it comes to the animal kingdom. Imagine an untrained human fighting against a domestic cat. Obviously, the human would win the fight, even if they weren't a great fighter. This goes to show the huge emphasis on strength when it comes to combat. Even within species, humans are given a huge advantage by strength. If you think about it, this is why weight classes were developed, so that fights are fair and even. Secondly, this debate shows how dependent humans are on technology. Although humans may be physically inferior to many species, if they are armed with weapons, then they can dominate those same animals. This may be unfair as it changes the nature of combat. However, the wildlife world doesn't care if things are unfair, and only winning is important. In conclusion, even the best of human fighters would lose to the average chimp. Sadly, there are still a number of delusional people online that overvalue the skills of MMA fighters or humans in general. As mentioned, they may be technically superior, but the sheer strength and athleticism advantage by the chimp would be far too much to give an MMA fighter any sort of real chance.